Okay. So, because the Renaissance is a rebirth, a reawakening, a reimagining of classical civilization, I thought we might do a quick tour and look at some of the examples of Greek and Roman art and architecture and literature that were popping up during the 13th, 14th, and 15th century Renaissance Europe. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. And if there's anything here that you feel like we ought to talk about or do a deeper dive into, please let me know in the discussion section, and I'm more than happy to do that, or at least point you in the right direction. So, in the 1300s, in our Quattrocentro, we have artists and literary-minded people like Francesco Petrarco, who takes the Latin name Petrarch, who's looking at some of the work of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and using that work to inform his work, or copying that work, or making copies of that work available to the educated elites in places like Florence. So when we talk about Greek philosophy, we could be here all day, but think of the big three. Think of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Think of the the Stoic movement, which the Romans took and copied and really liked, and things like Epicureanism, which the Romans really liked. Um, when we say Greek and Roman, or sometimes we use the term Greco-Roman, when the Roman Republic and then Empire expanded to include Greece, or what had been Greece, uh, there's an old saying that conquered we conquer, and the Roman Empire took over the Greek city states and this land of Greece, or Hellas. But they found the culture to be so appealing that they basically copied it and made it their own. So many works of art that we have that we think are Greek are really just Roman copies of Greek statues, or Roman copies of Greek buildings. And then kind of Rome added their own like twist to it. So we have Greek philosophy, we have works of literature, starting with the original adventure story, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, through through the playwrights, the comedians, and dramatists of the golden age of Athens. Your Aeschylus, your Euripides, your Aristophanes, to people like Virgil, who was writing in the first century A.D. Uh, for Augustus, and he told the story of what happened to the people of Troy after the end of the Trojan War, and that was Virgil's Aeneid. To the philosophy and meditations of the poet slash philosopher slash Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He dug up political speeches by people like Julius Caesar, by Cato the Elder, Cato the Younger, and the most important one, of course, is Cicero. Much of this work had been destroyed. Much of it had been lost to the ravages of time. Think about it. If we're sitting here in 1350 AD and we're talking about something that was created in 475 BC, we're talking about something that's very close to being 2,000 years old. So a lot of it had simply been lost. But what remained kind of remained on the fringes. And so, like Irish monks and cloistered monks all over Europe are dutifully copying some of these things. But the problem with this Roman literature and this Greek literature uh, during this age is that it wasn't considered as worthy as the philosophy of Christian writers. Let's look at the word philosophy. It literally means the love of wisdom. And what is the ultimate wisdom? The ultimate wisdom comes to us from the Bible. So political leaders and church leaders looked at this stuff and said, well, some of it is very interesting, but there's very little that it can do for us. In a God-centered paradigm, in a God-centered world, what can Socrates really tell you? What can Virgil really give to us? And the answer for many of them was no. There can't be. Now there are exceptions to that. You have church writers like Marcus Aurelius trying to blend or synthesize Greek logic with church writings, with Christianity. But for most of them, this is just like a kind of an interesting thing that's borderline seditious. Because it came before Christ, then maybe we shouldn't even be looking at it. And certainly there's nothing here that can help people in their ultimate goal, which is to glorify God and to get to heaven. But during the Renaissance, people start looking at this stuff with a new eye. Like, hey, maybe there is some value to the things that came during this time. There is a natural beauty to it, and maybe there's something here that we can learn. Where you really see the influence is in Greek and Roman architecture and how that starts popping up in Italy and then in other places. So I thought just for fun, we'd take a whirlwind tour through some of these ancient buildings and some of this ancient architecture and see where it leads. So the first place we're going to go is ancient Mycenae. So this is one of the first great civilizations in what will become Greece. And if you're familiar with the story of the Trojan War, King Agamemnon was the leader of Mycenae, and he's the guy who uses his brother, who is the king of Sparta's misfortune, and declares war on the Trojans. And it's all very interesting, and maybe we'll do a lecture series on the Trojan War if that's something that people are interested in. But this is the beehive tomb of Agamemnon. We're not really sure if it's Agamemnon. We just kind of want it to be. The German historian, the German archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, the same guy who discovered the walls of Troy, kind of dug up parts of Mycenae. So this civilization predates classical Greece by 500 years. These are called if you walk into ancient Mycenae through the Lion's Gate, you come across this. Greeks referred to this as the Cycloptic Wall because they had no idea how it was built. So they just assumed that the ancient Cyclops picked these giant stones up and made it into a wall. There's no masonry here. They're just those stones are just arranged that way. So Europeans won't reach this level of building again for another 500 years. And then after the collapse of Rome, we won't see this level of building sophistication for another 1,000 years, if that, 1,500 years. So here we are at Mycenae, and we're looking out, and we're looking at the face of Agamemnon in the mountains. Something interesting about ancient Greece here. For those of you who have been there, you know that Greece is very rugged and Greece is very mountainous, which allow these different civilizations to kind of grow up like little petri dishes for individual civilizations, which is why we get so much differentiation between the different polis, the different city-states. So, you're probably all familiar with ancient Sparta or ancient Corinth and ancient Athens, and they kind of all develop on their own little track because they were isolated via the mountains. The only thing that really tied them together was the sea. There's Agamemnon's face in the mountains. When Schliemann digs up Troy, he finds a burial mask that you can today see in the Acropolis Museum at Athens, I believe. And we're not really sure. Historians don't really know, but we like piecing things together like this. So in terms of Greek art and culture, Here we are at Epidaurus. So this is the great theater at Epidaurus. The bottom part of the theater was built around 500 BC, and then when the Romans conquered Greece, they added that second tier, the one that I'm sitting on when I'm taking this picture. So the word theater comes from the Greek theatron, and the cool thing about the Greeks here, look, this is 2,500 years ago, and the Greeks were masters of the science of acoustics. So if you go to Epidaurus today, you see where the guy is standing on that circle inside the larger circle. So if that person were to speak at a regular tone, as loud as I'm speaking now, or even softer, where I am at the very top, I can hear him speaking in his natural voice because of the acoustics. It's designed to muffle out low tones and pick up higher tones. So a lot of famous musicians and singers have performed here. If you're familiar with Maria Callas, she did a concert at Epidaurus not too long before she died. Okay, this is the main event. So I am in Athens. It's the largest city in Greece. The prominent stone monolith in front of me is the Acropolis, and that's it's not the highest point in Athens, but it's the largest high point in Athens, which made it a very defensible position. So the Acropolis was occupied or has been occupied for thousands of years. But those buildings that we see on top of the Acropolis were built during the Golden Age of Greece, after the Persian invasion, 480, 479 BC, were turned back. So I took the picture from here so you can see another really interesting thing that was built during the Roman era, and that is a water clock or a water tower. So you see people interested in the science of being able to tell time, and then the amazing architecture that we associate with the Acropolis. We make our way up the Acropolis and we can see some more Roman architecture. So this is a Roman copy of a Greek-style theater, the kind that we saw at Epidaurus. And we can tell this is Roman because there is the quintessential, well, for two reasons. One is the use of concrete, and the other one is the quintessential Roman architectural form, which we are going to see again when we study buildings in the Renaissance. You can probably tell me what it is in the background. That's right, the Roman arch. So the use of the arch and the use of concrete. This one's pretty interesting too. Because of the acoustics here and because of how good they were, if you've ever heard the album, I'm probably dating myself here, but if you've ever heard the album Yanni live at the Acropolis, this is where he did it. For those of you who are younger than 30, I guess just Google Yanni, or not. In fact, if you're younger than 30, I'm really sorry for saying the word Yanni. So we make our way up to what I would consider the highlight of Greek architecture and Greek civilization. We are now at the top of the Acropolis, and we go through a structure called the Propylaea. This is the gateway into the Acropolis, the top of it. And in the foreground, we're looking at a stone column. These were so masterfully put together that they're done completely without the use of masonry. You could take even thousands of years later, you can take a piece of paper and try to slide it between those drum sections of the columns, and you won't be able to do it. That's how tightly they fit together. So, from far back, it doesn't look, it looks like, the columns are kind of made like an obelisk, like it's one section, but that's not the case. They're fit together like almost like Legos. Those columns, which we'll look at in greater detail when we actually get to the Acropolis itself, will become an important feature in Renaissance architecture as well. So when Renaissance builders are putting together their buildings, what do you think they're using? They're using arches, they're using columns, they're using the different orders of columns, and they're using pediments. All right, so there it is. So all of these pictures are mine, incidentally. Either I took them or a student took them. So I've been very fortunate to be able to go to Greece a number of times and Italy a number of times with students. So this is the Acropolis. It is as perfect a building as you will ever see. Now, obviously it's in a sorry state. The Greek government is going through jumping through hoops to try to restore it to its original glory or its original grandeur. When Greece was occupied by the Ottoman Turks in the 15th century and beyond, it was briefly turned into a mosque. It was used to store ammunition. The ammunition was hit by a lightning bolt, and the thing blew up. So it doesn't look great right now, but believe me, it's come a long way. In the foreground, you see those columns, and above the columns is the pediment, that triangular-looking thing. So again, in Renaissance architecture, we're going to get those columns. We're going to get the pediment. If you had been standing here in, say, the 3rd century BC, this would have looked completely different. That pediment would have been decorated with individual sculptures. And if you can take a look at the kind of the top left of the pediment, you see there looked like a sculpture there. Well, sculptures which were completed all the way around. It wasn't low relief. This is high relief. All ringed the entire Acropolis. In the 19th century, a British aristocrat and adventurer by the name of Lord Elgin bribed the Greek government to allow him to come in and saw all of those statues away. And if you want to see them today, they're in the British Museum. I'll talk more about that maybe as we go. But this building is perfect. There is just a confluence of science and geometry and math that make this thing perfect. In fact, it's more than perfect. So if you look at the columns, or if you got right up close to the columns, you'd notice that they bow out in the middle, and that's to account for something called entasis. If we were to stand up really close, we'd see it. But if they didn't build them to bow out in the middle, then standing far away, it would appear less than perfect. So, I like to say that the Acropolis is more than perfect. It is, and the fact that it's 2,500 years old just makes it beyond amazing. If you ever get a chance to go here, I highly recommend it. Greece is a really great trip. This is from the Acropolis looking down. The newer building that you see there in the foreground is the new Acropolis Museum. And the entire top floor is essentially empty because the Greek government is trying to get the British Museum to return the Elgin marbles that decorated the top of the Acropolis to them, so they can put in this museum. A lot of the things that we'll see in some of these ancient places have been removed and put into museums because of acid rain, and you need to go inside of a museum, a climate-controlled museum, to actually see the originals. This is the Erechtheum, and the famous part of the Erechtheum at the Acropolis is the Porch of Maidens. So that's a gabled support beam that they turned into this like porch, and then they carved the all individual maidens, caryatids, to kind of like support the beam. which is pretty cool. And here we are, me and some of my students at the Acropolis, pondering Greek architecture. And you can see it, there I am. So I took this picture so you can see the different layers. So at the very top, that's the Greek Acropolis. And then as we go down, we have some Roman buildings, which include the use of the arch. This is Mount Olympus. That's where the Greek gods and goddesses live. I'm told I didn't get up to the top, so I didn't get to say hi to Zeus, but he's up there. The Hellenistic pantheon, meaning Greek gods and goddesses, and then their Roman equivalent, will pop up in Renaissance art. Thinking of the obvious example is Botticelli's Birth of Venus. So while the majority of artwork that we're going to look at is going to be Christian, the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods pop up as well. This is Delphi, and that probably sounds familiar. So the famous home of the Oracle. So this served as kind of like a giant bank for the Greek city-states, and a lot of Greek city-states would build houses of tribute or temples where they would keep offerings to the gods and offerings to the Oracle at Delphi. I like this building. It's a temple / bank that Athens built for the Oracle, and we see all of the different architectural styles that we're going to see repeated in Renaissance architecture. So those are Doric columns, and then the pediment, which would have been adorned at the time. And this is a view of the building from the other side. Again, without masonry, just blocks fit together. And the number of earthquakes that it's withstood in the last 2,500 years is also pretty amazing. You may be wondering what that cone-shaped rock is in the foreground. That's according to legend, that's the navel stone to mark the navel of the world. So Jupiter, in his avatar as a giant eagle, flew around the world and dropped this stone in the center of the world, which the Greeks knew was in Greece. And I think I asked our tour guide, well, is that, that's a at least 2,500-year-old stone, probably older. You just have it out here? And she said, no, of course not. Why would we do that? That's a Roman copy. That stone is only 2,000 years old. Okay, so here's an example of a Greek sculpture. This is a bronze sculpture that we call the Charioteer. Really interesting here. So it is cast bronze, and we know a few things about this guy. It was dug up in pieces about 100 years ago and then reassembled, and now you have to go to the museum at Delphi to see it. Charioteers in ancient Greece were prized. Typically, they were teenagers, young men, because of how light they were and how useful that lack of weight was in driving the chariot. But it really is amazing how lifelike he is. And that degree of how lifelike he is from 2,500 years ago won't be repeated in sculpture until we get to the likes of Michelangelo and Donatello. This is closer to Michelangelo's David or Donatello's David or Donatello's Gattamelata than anything that we would see in the 10th, 11th, or 12th century, which is amazing if you think about it. I mean, this is a level of artistry and sophistication that planet Earth just lost. The thing I love most about it is the tunic that he's wearing. That in Greece, especially in the Olympic Games, people competed naked. So the Greek word for naked is gymnos, which is where we get the English word gymnastics. The fact that he's wearing clothes here suggests that he might be a person of lower rank or lower status. But I'm glad that he is wearing clothes because the texture on the tunic is just amazing. It almost looks like, you could reach out and grab it, and he's, you could take a bunch of cloth in your hand. That's how lifelike the cloth around his arms are. The charioteer. So that's ancient Greece. And like I said, when the Romans get to Greece, they copy everything about the culture that they like. So the Greeks find themselves occupied, but the Romans find themselves occupied by Greek culture. So here we are at the Pantheon, which is famous Roman building, 1st century AD, in the center of Rome. In the foreground, that's an Egyptian obelisk. The Romans, once they conquered Egypt, became fascinated with like Egypt stuff. So in the same way that the people of the Renaissance are fascinated with what they thought ancient Greece and ancient Rome looked like, the ancient Romans were fascinated with Egypt. And that starts around the time that Caesar conquers ancient Egypt and falls in love with Cleopatra, which is just another great story. So that's an Egyptian obelisk. In the background is one of the most famous buildings in all of European history, and that's the Pantheon. Pantheon, for millennia, had the world's largest freestanding concrete dome. So the use of the dome is also something that the Romans are noted for. So if you're reading the inscription, Agrippa, who built this building, was the chief general, chief advisor to the first Roman emperor, the guy who once and for all ended the Roman Republic, and that was Augustus, Julius Caesar Augustus. But look at the building. You've got columns, Corinthian-style columns, and a pediment. Today, this is something of like a church or a shrine to the nation of Italy. So lots of famous people are buried here. The first king of Italy, when Italy is finally made a country. Italy's not a country until 1840s, 1850s. So Victor Emmanuel, the first king of Italy, is buried here. Dante is buried here. Some very famous people are buried at the Pantheon. One of the things I've noticed about Greek and Italian architecture, it's from an American perspective, it's very cozy, it's very tight. So you're comfortable in these buildings if you are comfortable in a smart car. Here we have the Flavian Amphitheater. And so what I want to point out here is, well, you probably know what I want to point out here at this point. So the use of concrete, Roman concrete was incredibly strong, and we're still not exactly sure what the recipe was, but very strong enough to withstand, thousands of years of history. So obviously, we call the Flavian Theater the Colosseum. It was a nickname for the building because of the colossal statue of Nero that stood nearby. And it's the repeated use of the arch that I think makes it other than its size, the repeated use of the arch in the Colosseum makes it such an interesting building. Here we have the interior of the Colosseum. So as a public space, the Flavian Amphitheater was a place where they put on shows. And for those of you that know a little bit about Roman history, yeah, they would do gladiatorial combat in here. And they have it kind of halfway cut away. But if you've seen the movie Gladiator, you'll probably recall a few scenes where soldiers or wild animals are raised out of the out of the like an underground area and brought up to the stage that way. And we can see the inner workings here. That's why it was done. Now, later, this building will be turned into a church. So you can see, if you look all the way to the left-hand side of my photo, a pope came in, put a cross there, turned it into the church. They still do Stations of the Cross just about every year there. And the reason for that is people were coming in and just robbing the place blind. Builders were just stealing stones and stealing pieces of metal from the Colosseum. And it was in a real danger of falling down or being knocked down. So when they consecrated it as a church, now you can't steal from it anymore. But what an interesting piece of architecture. And some of these things will be repeated again when we get to the Renaissance. There's another photo. This time the cross is on the right-hand side. But just the size, the scale, and the scope of it. Europeans won't do anything like this in terms of size or scale until we get to the great cathedrals of the 12th and 13th century. This is the Forum Romanum, the Roman Forum, like an open-air marketplace. In the Renaissance, we see the construction of these great palazzes or piazzas, which are like open-air forums and markets. Finally, going to the south of Italy, here we are right outside of Naples near Mount Vesuvius. And for those of us who are interested in city construction or town building, we have a preserved Roman town. And this, of course, is Pompeii. So Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed or covered completely in volcanic ash after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the 1st century. And isn't this cool? We were able to excavate the town. So we basically have an entire preserved Roman town. These are the streets. Streets were built a little bit lower because of the necessity to remove waste from the city. So these guys were pretty thorough engineers. Now you've probably heard the story of the lead pipes and how lead poisoning from lead pipes contributed to the collapse of the Republic and the Empire. And I got it. You know, they didn't know too much about the periodic table of the elements. Although I believe the elemental sign for lead is Pb, right? Plumbum, which is where we get the modern term plumber. In a number of major cities, like Florence and Paris and Rome, you have this giant river that flows through the city. And that's how we remove wastewater and bad stuff from the city. But for towns that were too small, that didn't have a river running through it, the Romans were smart and built their cobblestone streets a little bit lower. So when people would dump their trash, their human waste, their animal waste directly in the roads, and then when it would rain, when you'd get a rainstorm, it would kind of like flush all of that bad stuff out of the city, because they were built on gradients, gradual, an almost imperceptible downward slope. They were very good at that. Math is something that they knew. So now that I've told you that story, you can probably figure out what those stones are for. If you had to cross the road when it was wet, or even when it wasn't wet, if you wanted to dodge the animal waste and the human waste. There they are. And those ruts are from carts being dragged through the streets. Here we have the interior painting of one of the villas. So one of the cool things about Pompeii is the preserved bodies. So when the ash fell and covered people, we have preserved This actually isn't a body in that you couldn't cut into it and see bone and skin, but it was a pocket left by the ash. And when the organic stuff dissolved, you had this human-sized pocket. So we filled it with, plaster, and then when the plaster cast was uncovered, hey, here you have a body. So we know how they lived, we know how they died. It tells us a little something about what the Romans and Greeks valued in their buildings. Like the most expensive real estate was, as you can imagine, near the ones that were near public fountains. Location, location, location. Here's the Forum at Pompeii, and that will be it for Greek and Roman architecture and literature. The next thing that we're going to talk about is some art and painting in the Middle Ages, and we'll use that as our baseline to compare the art and architecture of the early Renaissance era. So we'll take a look at maybe some great cathedrals and compare that to what we're building in 13th and 14th century Florence. Okay.